Every Sherman tank that broke through the Normandy hedgerows in July 1944 carried something strange on its bow. Four steel prongs that looked like they'd been ripped from a medieval fortress. German soldiers called them iron tusks. American tankers called them lifesavers. And the man who invented them? He was a 29-year-old sergeant who got the idea by staring at junk on a beach. Before I go any further, grab yourself something to drink, settle in, because what you're about to hear is the kind of story that changes how you think about war. It's not about generals or grand strategy. It's about a problem that was killing hundreds of men and one soldier who refused to accept that's just how things had to be. And listen, this one's worth hearing all the way through. So hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's talk about Curtis Culin. Here's what you need to understand first. The hedgerows of Normandy weren't hedges, not in any normal sense. Think of them as earthen walls, 12 feet high, 4 feet thick at the base, reinforced by root systems that had been growing since the Middle Ages. French farmers had been piling field stones along their property lines for centuries. Dirt accumulated over those stones. Trees took root. By 1944, these barriers were tougher than concrete. When American tanks tried crossing these ancient boundaries, they had to climb. And when a Sherman climbed, it exposed its belly. 1 inch of armor protecting the underside. German anti-tank teams knew exactly where to aim. Panzerfaust rockets, anti-tank guns, they waited for that moment when the Sherman's nose went up, and they fired straight into the exposed underbelly. Most crews didn't make it out. Between June 6th and July 10th, 1944, First Army lost over 400 Sherman tanks trying to push through these hedgerows. 400 tanks. That's roughly 2,000 men killed or wounded, not counting infantry losses. The American advance had moved 8 miles inland in more than a month. At that rate, breaking out of Normandy would take half a year, maybe longer. The Germans knew it. They'd positioned their defenses specifically around this terrain, understanding that the bocage country gave them an advantage no amount of American industrial production could overcome. Every field was a fortress. Every hedgerow was a killing ground. Army engineers tried everything. They packed explosives into the base of hedgerows and detonated them. The blasts barely scratched the earth, and the noise attracted artillery. Some tank crews welded spare track links to their hulls for extra protection. It helped against machine gun fire, didn't do a thing against anti-tank rounds from 10 yards away. Other crews tried ramming hedgerows at full speed. The Shermans buried themselves nose first into packed earth and 500-year-old root systems, stuck there, immobilized, perfect targets. Army allocated 4 M4 dozer tanks per battalion, Shermans equipped with bulldozer blades. These could push through hedgerows, but they were slow, conspicuous, and every German gunner on the line knew to target them first. You couldn't base an offensive on 4 specialized vehicles per battalion when you needed to breach hundreds of hedgerows. This was the problem facing General Omar Bradley in early July 1944. Operation Cobra, the planned breakout offensive, required rapid armored movement through bocage terrain. Speed was essential, but nobody had figured out how to move tanks through hedgerows without exposing them to lethal fire. And then, a cavalry sergeant from New Jersey had an idea. Curtis Culin wasn't an engineer. He hadn't gone to West Point. He was a reconnaissance soldier with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division. His unit had been probing the hedgerows since June 20th, taking casualties, watching tanks burn, looking for any tactical advantage. On a supply run to the beaches, Culin noticed something. The Germans had planted thousands of obstacles on the invasion beaches, steel anti-landing craft barriers called check hedgehogs. 3 railway iron beams welded together in a cross shape, designed to rip the hulls of landing craft. American engineers had been cutting them apart with torches and stacking the pieces in piles. Culin looked at those steel beams and thought, what if you welded them to a tank? Not for armor, for cutting. If you angled steel prongs forward from a tank's bow, they'd dig into the base of the hedgerow instead of climbing over it. The tank would push straight through at ground level. No exposure, no belly armor visible to German guns. Just forward momentum and thick steel doing what thick steel does. He sketched the design on a ration box, 4 prongs welded to mounting plates, bolted to a tank's bow. The prongs angled forward at 35 degrees. Simple, crude even, but it might work. He spent 3 days building a prototype. He took 4 sections of hedgehog steel, each piece 2 inches thick, and welded them to a light tank. Then he tested it, drove the tank at a hedgerow, hit the earthen wall at speed, and the prongs bit through. The tank pushed forward. The hedgerow collapsed inward. 15 seconds, maybe less. He tested it 7 times, 7 successful breaches. Major Sidney Bingham from 2nd Armored Division heard about the tests and ordered a demonstration with a full-weight Sherman. The light tank weighed 15 tons. A Sherman weighed 33 tons. More than double the weight, more than double the impact force. If the prongs couldn't handle a Sherman, the whole idea was worthless. Lieutenant Charles Green volunteered his crew. They welded Culin's 4-prong assembly to Green's Sherman on July 11th. The device weighed 320 pounds. They tested it the next day. 4 runs, 4 successful breaches. The prongs held. Word reached Bradley's headquarters. July 13th, 1944, 9:42 in the morning. General Omar Bradley stepped out of a jeep near St. Lo, pointed at a hedgerow 200 yards away, and told Lieutenant Green, "Show me." Green's Sherman positioned itself 50 yards from the target. The hedgerow was 12 feet high, thick as any that had stopped American armor for 6 weeks. Bradley raised his binoculars. Green's voice came over the radio. "Ready to demonstrate breach." Bradley said one word: "Proceed." The Sherman accelerated, 25 miles per hour. The 4 steel prongs struck the earthen wall with a sound like a freight train hitting a mountain. Dirt exploded upward. For 3 seconds, the Sherman pushed against 5 centuries of compacted earth and root systems. Then the prongs bit through. The hedgerow collapsed. The Sherman burst through the other side in 14 seconds. Bradley lowered his binoculars. He walked to the gap, touched the torn earth, examined the severed roots. Then he turned to his staff and said, "I want 3,000 of these. Every Sherman in 1st Army gets one. Operation Cobra launches in 12 days. That's when the real problem started. Building one prototype in 3 days is one thing. Building 3,000 devices in 12 days is something else entirely. That meant modifying 250 tanks per day, 10 tanks per hour, 1 tank every 6 minutes for 12 straight days. Captain James Daugherty from the 52nd Ordnance Group got the assignment. He arrived at a production site near Colombière on July 14th with 30 welders and 6 cutting torch rigs. The process looked simple on paper. Cut hedgehog beams into 4-foot sections, grind edges to points, weld to mounting plates, bolt plates to tank bow. 4 hours per vehicle if nothing went wrong. Everything went wrong. The German steel was harder than standard construction grade. Cutting torches overheated after 20 minutes and needed cooling time. The first day's production yielded 8 completed devices, 8 tanks out of 3,000. At that rate, they'd finish modifications sometime in October. Cobra would launch without them. The bocage stalemate would continue. Men would keep dying in burning Shermans. Culin spent July 15th troubleshooting. The problem was heat buildup in the torch tips. German steel absorbed thermal energy slower than American steel, causing the cutting equipment to fail faster than expected. He requisitioned additional torch assemblies and organized the welders into rotation shifts, one team cutting while another team's equipment cooled. Production increased to 22 devices on July 15th, still nowhere near sufficient. Doherty brought in 40 more welders from maintenance battalions across Normandy. By July 17th, production reached 38 devices per day. The math remained brutal. 3,000 tanks, 38 per day, 79 days total. Cobra launched in 8 days. Then they discovered another problem. The 320-pound assembly shifted a Sherman's center of gravity forward by 6 inches when bolted to the bow. After repeated impacts during testing, front suspension springs showed stress fractures. If those springs failed in combat, the tank would be immobilized with a broken front end, sitting still while German guns found the range. Culin modified the mounting system. Instead of bolting the prongs directly to the bow plate, he added reinforcement brackets that distributed weight across the hull's structural frame. The modification added 30 minutes to each installation, but prevented suspension failure. By July 19th, 6 days before Cobra, production reached 64 devices per day. The Ordnance Group had completed approximately 400 modifications. 2,600 tanks remained. Bradley's staff sent a message. The general wanted a minimum of 2,000 Rhinos, that's what they were calling them now, Rhinos, for the offensive. If the Ordnance Group couldn't meet that number, Cobra might be delayed. Every day of delay meant more German reinforcements. Every day of delay meant more casualties. Doherty found more steel. Engineers had stockpiled additional Czech hedgehogs near Utah Beach. Transportation units hauled the obstacles inland on July 20th. The Ordnance Group now had enough raw material for 5,000 devices. The bottleneck remained welding capacity. Culin contacted maintenance sections from units not scheduled for Cobra's first wave. Tank recovery teams had welding equipment for field repairs. He organized them into auxiliary production cells. 15 additional welding stations came online July 21st. Production jumped to 112 devices per day. The production site looked like an industrial factory dropped into a Norman field. Welders worked through the night under floodlights powered by mobile generators. Sparks from cutting torches illuminated rows of tanks waiting for modification. The smell of hot metal and welding flux hung in the air. Nobody slept more than 4 hours. July 22nd, 3 days before Cobra. Production total reached 1,200 devices. Doherty calculated they could install another 850 before the offensive launched. Total, 2,050 Rhino tanks, 77% of Bradley's armor. Not 3,000, not perfect, but maybe enough. The modified tanks moved to forward assembly areas on July 24th. Culin walked through the staging zones near Marigny, watching column after column of Shermans roll past. Every single tank carried 4 steel prongs on its bow. They looked absurd, like prehistoric animals equipped for battle. Operation Cobra would begin with a massive air bombardment at dawn, July 25th. 3,000 Allied aircraft dropping 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions. Culin watched from a forward observation post 3 miles behind the start line. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. When it stopped, the silence felt unnatural. At 7:45 a.m., the first Rhino tanks crossed into the bocage. 2nd Armored Division led the assault. 3rd Armored Division followed. 1st Infantry Division provided support. Every tank carried Culin's 4-prong device or the railroad-based variant. They looked absurd, like prehistoric animals equipped for battle. Operation Cobra worked. When Bradley asked for 3,000 Rhino tanks, he had said anything would be better than 0. 2,300 Rhino tanks hit the German lines like a sledgehammer. The Germans were not prepared for this. Their defensive doctrine assumed American tanks would climb over hedgerows, exposing vulnerable belly armor. Panzerfaust teams positioned themselves for upward shots at exposed undersides. Anti-tank guns aimed at predictable climb points. When the Rhinos punched straight through at ground level, the German firing solutions became worthless. By 10:30 a.m., 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 miles. That normally took 3 days. 3rd Armored Division reported similar progress. The bocage defensive network was collapsing because the terrain advantage had disappeared. Hedgerows that stopped tanks for 6 weeks were now just obstacles that delayed advance by 15 seconds. But the devices weren't perfect. Reports of failure started coming in around 11 a.m. A Sherman from the 741st Tank Battalion hit a hedgerow with a buried stone foundation. The prongs bent backward on impact. The tank couldn't move forward or reverse. The crew abandoned the vehicle under machine gun fire. 2 men died getting out. Another failure at 11:20. A light tank's prongs broke off completely when they struck an iron fence post hidden in the hedge base. The device ripped away, taking part of the bow plate with it. The tank was combat ethical, but couldn't breach more hedgerows. A third failure at noon. A tank destroyer with railroad prongs hit a hedge at 30 miles per hour, too fast. The impact buckled the mounting brackets. The prongs twisted sideways and jammed the right track. Immobilized. The failure rate was approximately 4%. 4 failed breaches out of every 100 attempts. Not catastrophic, but significant. 4% of 2,300 tanks meant 92 devices would fail during Cobra. 92 crews potentially trapped in open fields with German guns targeting them. Culin monitored the radio traffic from the observation post. Most reports were positive, tanks advancing faster than any point since D-Day. But those failure reports gnawed at him. 4%, 92 tanks, 460 men. At 1:30 in the afternoon, a report came through that changed everything. A battalion from 3rd Armored Division had reached the Marigny-Saint Gilles Road. That was 4 miles inland, 4 miles in 6 hours. The same distance had taken 2 weeks in June. By 3 p.m., advanced elements were 5 miles inland. German units were retreating because they couldn't establish new defensive lines fast enough. The bocage terrain that protected them had become useless. American armor was moving through it like open ground. Bradley's headquarters issued an assessment at 4:15. Operation Cobra was succeeding beyond projections. The Rhino tanks had solved the bocage problem. Estimated German casualties were 3 times higher than American losses. The defensive stalemate was broken. Culin left the observation post at 5 p.m. He drove back toward the production site at Colombière. The welding stations were abandoned now. All the tanks had moved forward. The field was empty except for cut steel scraps and burnt-out torch tips. He sat on a Jeep hood and tried to process what happened. A sketch on a ration box 3 weeks ago. Beach obstacle steel welded to tank bows. And now the entire Normandy front was moving because tanks could punch through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. The failure rate bothered him. 4% meant the design wasn't perfect. Stone foundations, hidden fence posts, impact speeds, variables he hadn't tested. 92 crews paying the price for those gaps. But 2,200 devices worked. 11,000 men advancing through terrain that should have killed them. The math was brutal, but clear. 4% failure was better than 60% casualties from exposed belly armor. As the sun set, he could hear artillery fire in the distance. The front had moved 8 miles inland, 8 miles in 1 day. The bocage was behind them now. July 26th. Bradley's headquarters issued production orders for additional hedge cutters. Units advancing beyond the bocage were encountering scattered hedgerow lines in interior France. The devices remained useful. By July 28th, the production count reached 2,850 modified tanks. That represented approximately 60% of First Army's armored vehicles. The remaining 40% were specialized vehicles that couldn't mount the devices or units held in reserve. The geographic spread was remarkable. 2nd Armored Division used Rhino tanks from Saint-Lô to Coutances. 3rd Armored Division employed them from Marigny to Avranches. 1st Infantry Division deployed them during the Mortain counterattack. 4th Armored Division received devices on July 30th and used them advancing toward Brittany. Different units adapted the basic design. The 747th Tank Battalion preferred heavy railroad prongs. 2nd Armored Division standardized on Culin's lighter hedgehog steel version. Some tank destroyer units welded shorter 3-prong variants to preserve gun traverse. Light tank crews used 2-prong versions to reduce weight. Maintenance units developed field repair procedures. Bent prongs could be straightened with hydraulic jacks. Broken welds could be re-welded in 30 minutes. Completely destroyed devices could be replaced in 2 hours if spare prongs were available. The production site at Colombières became a repair depot, processing damaged devices and returning them to service. The tactical impact extended beyond hedgerow breaching. German units retreated faster because they couldn't establish defensive positions fast enough. Panzer divisions withdrew toward the Seine River. American armor advanced 40 miles in 8 days. The Falaise Pocket formed because German units couldn't escape the encirclement. Rhino tanks blocked retreat routes through bocage terrain that should have provided cover. Intelligence reports from captured German officers revealed their perspective. They called the devices hedge devils or iron tusks. Several prisoners stated they abandoned defensive positions when they realized American tanks could breach any hedgerow. One German commanding officer reported his anti-tank gun crew fled after watching 3 Shermans punch through hedges they considered impenetrable. By August 5th, the bocage campaign was effectively over. American forces had broken through into open French countryside. The hedgerow problem that stopped them for 6 weeks had been solved in 12 days. Bradley's staff calculated the Rhino devices accelerated the breakout by approximately 4 to 6 weeks. The statistical impact was significant. Between July 25th and August 10th, American tank casualties dropped 37% compared to June and early July. That represented approximately 300 tanks not destroyed and 1,500 crew members not killed or wounded. The 4% device failure rate was negligible compared to the casualty reduction. Not all units kept their devices. As tanks advanced beyond Normandy into regions without dense hedgerow terrain, crews began removing the prongs. The 320-pound weight penalty affected fuel consumption and top speed on roads. By mid-August, approximately 40% of Rhino tanks had removed their cutters. Some units retained them. 4th Armored Division kept their devices through September, encountering occasional hedgerow terrain in eastern France. 2nd Armored Division stored removed prongs on supply trucks in case they needed reinstallation. The devices were still in use on September 2nd when American forces liberated Paris. A few Rhino tanks participated in the Liberation Parade, their steel prongs still visible on the bow plates. French civilians didn't know what the strange metal tusks meant. American tankers knew those prongs represented the difference between dying in a Norman field and reaching Paris. Culin watched the advance from Normandy. Bradley's staff had reassigned him to training duties, teaching new replacement crews about hedgerow tactics. He spent August demonstrating breach techniques at a training ground near Isigny. On August 15th, a courier delivered a message from Bradley's headquarters. General Bradley wanted to see him immediately. No explanation provided. Culin drove to headquarters wondering if something had gone wrong. 4% failure rate, 92 trapped tanks. Maybe command wanted explanations. He arrived at 5 p.m. and reported to Bradley's office. The general was waiting with several staff officers. Bradley held a folder with official letterhead visible. Culin realized this wasn't about failures. Bradley gestured to a chair. Culin sat. The general opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. It was a recommendation for the Legion of Merit, signed by Bradley, co-signed by Major General Leroy Watson. You're being awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct. Your hedgerow cutting device directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra and saved an estimated 1,500 American lives, Bradley said. Cullen stared at the document. The Legion of Merit was the fourth highest military decoration. Officers received it for campaign-level contributions. Sergeants almost never qualified. "Sir, I just welded some steel to tanks." "You solved a tactical problem that stopped First Army for 6 weeks. Every tank commander from here to Paris knows your name. The device is officially designated the Culin Hedgerow Cutting Device in Army records. You earned this." The ceremony took place on August 20th at a field near Saint-Lô. Bradley personally pinned the medal to Cullen's uniform. Approximately 200 officers and enlisted men attended. Several tank commanders whose crews used the devices were present. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion was there. He'd breached 47 hedgerows during Cobra without losing a single crew member. The citation read at the ceremony credited Cullen with exceptional ingenuity and technical skill in developing a device that overcame formidable terrain obstacles and facilitated the Allied advance through Normandy. It mentioned the production of 2,850 devices and the estimated casualty reduction. News of the award reached other Allied armies. British tank units requested technical specifications for the device. The British Army's 21st Army Group produced approximately 300 similar designs, though they called them prongs instead of rhinos. Canadian armored divisions manufactured 200 devices using salvaged German steel from their own beach sectors. The Soviet Union received technical drawings through Lend-Lease channels but never adopted the design. Soviet tank doctrine emphasized overwhelming force rather than terrain adaptation. They solved bocage-type problems by concentrating artillery fire until obstacles ceased to exist. The Culin device appeared in training manuals by September. The Army's Armored Force School at Fort Knox added hedgerow breaching techniques to its curriculum. New tank crews learned the tactical doctrine: approach at 25 miles per hour, strike the hedge base, maintain forward momentum for 15 seconds, clear the opposite side, continue advance. Field modifications continued through autumn 1944. Some crews added steel teeth to the prongs for better earth penetration. Others welded angled deflector plates to prevent the prongs from catching on buried obstacles. A few innovative crews created folding versions that could be retracted when not needed. The devices saw limited use after Normandy. The terrain beyond the bocage didn't require specialized breaching equipment. By October, most units had removed and stored their prongs. The few hedgerow encounters in Belgium and Germany were handled with standard dozers or infantry explosives. But the tactical lesson remained. Field improvisation using available materials could solve problems that stopped entire armies. Senior officers began encouraging similar innovation. When American forces encountered dragon's teeth anti-tank barriers in Germany, engineers developed improvised ramps from rubble and steel beams. The precedent came from Cullen's beach obstacle solution. Cullen returned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron on August 25th. His unit was advancing through northern France toward Belgium. He resumed duties as a cavalry sergeant. No special treatment, no headquarters assignment, just regular reconnaissance work. He participated in combat operations through September and October. His unit crossed into Germany in November. The war continued. The Rhino tanks were largely forgotten by then. New problems required new solutions. The bocage was 600 miles behind the front lines. The 102nd Cavalry reached the Elbe River in April. Germany surrendered on May 8th. Cullen had served 3 years in combat. He was 30 years old. The war was over. He returned to the United States in June 1945 and received his discharge papers. The Legion of Merit was listed in his service record. So was his role in developing the hedgerow cutter. But civilian life didn't care about wartime innovations. He needed a job. Culin returned to Cranford, New Jersey in July 1945. He married Bernice Enright in September. They moved to New York City, where he found work with Schenley Industries, a spirits company. The job had nothing to do with tanks or military engineering, just regular employment for a man trying to rebuild civilian life. The hedgerow cutter story followed him. Local newspapers ran articles about the Cranford sergeant who invented the device that broke the Normandy stalemate. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle published a feature while Culin was still in France. The article described how he showed his plans to his captains, how General Bradley called it revolutionary. But national recognition was limited. The war continued through 1945. Other innovations and battles dominated news coverage: the atomic bomb, victory in Europe, victory in Japan. A tank modification from July 1944 became historical footnote material. General Bradley changed that. He published his memoirs, A Soldier's Story, in 1951. The book included detailed descriptions of the bocage problem and Culin's solution. Bradley wrote that the device was so absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. He credited Culin by name and described watching the demonstration on July 13th. The memoir brought renewed attention. Military historians began citing the Culin device as an example of field innovation solving strategic problems. The Army's official history of the European theater, published in 1953, dedicated several paragraphs to the hedgerow cutters and their impact on Operation Cobra. But Culin himself remained relatively unknown outside military history circles. He worked at Schenley Industries through the 1950s. He was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, connecting to his family's Revolutionary War heritage. He lived quietly in New York City. No interviews, no speaking engagements, just a regular life. The tactical doctrine inspired by his innovation had lasting impact. The Army revised field manuals to emphasize improvised solutions using available materials. Training programs taught officers to encourage enlisted innovations rather than waiting for official equipment. The concept that a sergeant could solve a strategic problem became institutionalized. NATO forces adopted similar approaches. British, Canadian, and French armies developed their own field modification protocols. The Soviet Union, despite rejecting the hedgerow cutter itself, began allowing more tactical flexibility at lower command levels. The precedents set in Normandy influenced Cold War military doctrine. The actual devices mostly disappeared. A few Rhino tanks were preserved in museums. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox displayed a Sherman with original hedgehog prongs. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans later acquired a similar example. But most of the 2,850 devices were scrapped or lost. The engineering principles survived. Modern combat engineers study the Culin device as a case study in rapid field adaptation. The concept of using enemy obstacles as raw materials for friendly innovations appears in current military training. Army engineers in Iraq and Afghanistan applied similar thinking when developing counter-IED equipment. Curtis Culin died on November 20, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. The obituary in local papers mentioned his Legion of Merit and his role in developing the hedgerow cutter, but the notice was brief. Few people outside military history remembered the innovation or its significance. 1 year later, something unexpected happened. President Dwight Eisenhower gave a television interview to CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite on the 20th anniversary of D-Day. Cronkite asked about the bocage problem. Eisenhower told the story of the hedgerow cutter. He described Culin by name and explained how the device changed the campaign. The interview aired on June 6, 1964. Millions of Americans watched. Eisenhower's endorsement, delivered on national television by a former Supreme Allied commander, transformed the hedgerow cutter from footnote to legend. Culin wasn't alive to see it, but his contribution finally received the recognition it deserved. The interview footage was filmed in actual Normandy hedgerow country. Eisenhower stood in a field near Saint-Lô, showing Cronkite where the original demonstration occurred. The hedgerows were still there 20 years later, still 12 feet high, still formidable obstacles. And Eisenhower explained how one sergeant from New Jersey solved a problem that baffled an entire army. The modern legacy of Curtis Culin's invention exists in three places: museum exhibits, military doctrine, and the memories of veterans who survived because of 4 steel prongs welded to tank bows. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, displays an M4 Sherman with original Culin-type hedgerow cutters. The placard explains the bocage problem and how a sergeant from New Jersey solved it with German beach obstacle steel. Approximately 30,000 visitors see the exhibit annually. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans acquired a similar Sherman in 2007. Their exhibit includes photographs of the production line at Colombière and copies of Bradley's original orders for mass production. Interactive displays let visitors understand the engineering principles behind the prongs. The Musée du Débarquement in Normandy has a small section dedicated to American field innovations. They display actual hedgerow cutter prongs recovered from abandoned tanks near Saint-Lô. French visitors often don't recognize their significance. American veterans do. But the most important legacy isn't in museums, it's in doctrine. Every modern military force teaches the principle Culin demonstrated. Strategic problems can be solved with available materials, tactical initiative, and 15 seconds of courage. That lesson influenced equipment development, training protocols, and command philosophy for 80 years. The hedgerow cutter principle appeared in Iraq when soldiers welded scrap metal to Humvees for improvised armor protection. It appeared in Afghanistan when engineers modified mine-resistant vehicles using field-fabricated parts. It appears whenever soldiers face unexpected tactical problems and create solutions without waiting for official equipment. Curtis Culin's grave is in New Jersey. The headstone mentions his military service and his Legion of Merit. It doesn't mention the hedgerow cutter. Most people walking through that cemetery don't know who he was or what he did. But 1,500 men came home from Normandy because of his invention. Those men had children. Those children had children. The number of people alive today because Curtis Culin welded scrap steel to a tank in July 1944 is incalculable. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. He never knew that. He died thinking his contribution was a footnote. He worked a regular job, lived a quiet life, never sought recognition, never wrote memoirs, never gave interviews. Just a sergeant from Cranford who saw a problem and fixed it. The last surviving member of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron died in 2019. His obituary mentioned serving alongside Curtis Culin. The veteran remembered watching the first hedgerow breach. He said it was the moment he knew they'd survive Normandy. That's the real legacy. Not the medals, not the museum displays, not the doctrine manuals. The legacy is measured in lives. 1,500 men who didn't burn to death in Sherman tanks. 1,500 families who got their sons and husbands and fathers back. And it started with a sergeant staring at scrap steel on a Norman beach, imagining what those German obstacles could become if you welded them to American tanks. If you want to hear more stories like this, click the video that just appeared on your screen, and I'll see you there.